but also in the surrounding environment, to make the subsequent development of the characteristic or capability in question a realistic possibility. Now, I don't for one moment mean to deny that every organism starts life with its complement of DNA in the genome. However, for the genome to encode any kind of design specification, it would be necessary to suppose that some means exists of reading off this specification from the sequence of DNA base pairs that is independent of any developmental process. The fact is that no such means has ever been demonstrated. There is in truth only one reading of the genome, and that is the process of ontogenetic development itself. It follows that there can be no design for the organism other than its actual phenotypic form as it emerges within a particular developmental context. So the genotype, conceived as a context-independent design specification laying down certain capacities, simply does not exist. It's a figment of the biological imagination. What this means in general terms is that the forms and capacities of human and other organisms are attributable in the final analysis not to genetic inheritance, as this model suggests, but to the generative potentials of the developmental system. That is, the entire system of relations constituted by the presence of the organism, including, of course, its genes, in a particular environment. As the philosopher of biology Susan Oyama has pointed out, only within the context of such a system can we possibly say what any gene or cluster of genes is for. And so too, in the particular case of human beings, there can be no determination of what a human being is, no human nature, apart from the manifold ways in which humans become as they live out their lives in diverse communities and native environments. Since then ways of speaking, of playing music and so on are properties of neither genes nor culture, conceived as a package of transmissible information, but rather of developmental systems, to account for their evolution, we have to understand how such systems are constituted and reconstituted over time. And I think the key to this understanding lies in the recognition that humans, like all other creatures, set up through their own actions the environmental conditions both for their own future development and for the development of others to which they relate. So they figure not as passive sites of evolutionary change, but as creative agents, producers as well as products of their own evolution. Now clearly, neither orthodox evolutionary biology nor its complement in the field of culture theory is able to offer a coherent account of human development. According to the complementarity thesis, every human being is part ready-made genetically and in part moulded through the superimposition upon this preformed substrate of pre-existing norms and values. This moulding process is conventionally regarded as one of enculturation or socialization. Thus in childhood, as anthropologist Walter Goldsmith has put it, the infant is allegedly transformed from a purely biological being into a culture-bearing one. But real humans are not like that. Rather, they grow in an environment furnished by the presence and activities of others. To be sure, as people go through life, they grow out of certain ways of doing things and grow into others and not crawling on the floor anymore. But no one has ever grown out of biology or grown into society or culture. We don't progress in the course of our lives from a stage of biological incompletion as mere organisms to one of social completion as fully fledged persons. For every one of us is fully and indissolubly organism and person from beginning to end. And of course there is nothing in the least mere, that is partial or residual, about being an organism. Something you can be proud of, I think. Let me turn now from biology to psychology. I've already shown that it's impossible to derive a design specification for the organism from its genetic constitution alone, independently of the conditions of development in an environment. For cognitive science, this problem is further compounded, because if the theory of learning as the transmission of cultural information is to work, the requisite processing devices must already exist, not merely, as it were, on the drawing board, but in the concrete hardwiring of human brains. Attempts in the literature to resolve this problem, insofar as it's even recognized, are confused and contradictory. But to cut a rather long and tangled story short, they boil down to two distinct claims. One is that the concrete mechanisms making up what evolutionary psychologists call the mind's evolved architecture are reliably constructed or wired up under all possible circumstances. The other is that these universal mechanisms proceed to work on variable inputs from the environment to produce the diversity of manifest capabilities that we actually observe. Consider the specific example of language acquisition. Here, the alleged universal mechanism is the aforementioned language acquisition device, the LAD. All human infants, regardless of the language or languages they may end up speaking in later life, are supposed to come pre-equipped with such a device. It is a fact, say evolutionary psychologists John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, without incidentally citing any evidence to support their claim, that even individuals who survive a childhood of aberrant social isolation, though they may never acquire a language and remain incapable of speech, will nevertheless possess, I quote, the same species-typical language acquisition device as everyone else. During a well-defined stage of development, this device is said to be activated, operating on the input of speech sounds from the environment so as to install in the infant's mind the grammar and lexicon of the particular language spoken in his or her community. So it would appear, as I've shown in this diagram here, that the acquisition of language is a two-stage process. In the first stage, the language acquisition device itself develops. So there's some sort of design that comes with the genotype interacting with an environment. The result is the development of the language acquisition device. That language acquisition device then interacts with specific inputs from the environment in order to produce specific cultural competencies, such as the ability to speak English or French or Japanese. So notice how this model of first constructing the language acquisition device under all possible environmental circumstances, and then that language acquisition device processing specific inputs from the environment in order to develop the competence, say, to speak English or whatever. You see how this model depends on factoring out those features of the environment that are constant or reliably present in every conceivable developmental context from those that represent a source of variable input from one context to another. Only the former, the constant ones, are relevant in the first stage, that is, in the construction of the so-called innate mechanisms. Only the variable bits are relevant in the second stage, that is, in the acquisition of culturally specific capabilities. It's a bit like saying, that when a child learns to walk, first of all, it encounters the ground, or a universal thing, and then once it's got some sort of basic thing in place, by pedality, it starts encountering things like grass and gravel and concrete and so on. It's a bit difficult to see how that could work. I mean, of course, for comparative analytic purposes, it's sometimes helpful, sometimes even essential, to sift the general from the particular, or to establish a kind of lowest common denominator of development. But real environments are not partitioned in this way. Let me just continue for a moment with the example of language learning. Recent research has shown that from well before birth, infants are sensitive to the surrounding ambience of sound and, above all, to the mother's voice. So the human baby comes into the world already attuned